It began in the old and golden days of England, in a time when all the hedgerows were green and the roads dusty, when hawthorn and wild roses bloomed, when big-bellied landlords brewed rich October ale at a penny a pint. Welcome to Shire Reckoning. I'm Alistair Stevens. That opening quote comes from the beginning of George MacDonald Fraser's 1983 novel, The Pirates, with a Y, a savage and brilliant pastiche of the pirate adventure novel. Fraser is a fascinating writer who wrote, among other things, the screenplay for the Roger Moore Bond movie Octopussy and the Flashman novels, which take the school bully of Tom Brown's school days and turn him into a, let's say, roguish anti-hero. And I begin with this vision of England because this week on Shire Reckoning, we, reckon with the Shire. In part, this is coming out of our discussion during the seminar session last week and in the Last Call at the Green Dragon bonus episode about the calendar system of the Shire, the actual titular Shire Reckoning. But there's maybe not quite enough to mine out of that topic to fill an opening segment of this show, so we're going to gloss the history and the geography of this quiet, cozy, anachronistic, idyllic corner of Middle-earth, and consider why it's so powerful in the imagination of the reader. The origins of the Shire within the Legendarium can be found in the Second Age. After the defeat of Morgoth in the War of Wrath at the end of the First Age, the Valar raised the island of Numenor from the sea and offer it as a home to the Edain, the men who had fought against the armies of Morgoth. Some of those men accept the invitation to go and live there, under the kingship of Elros, the brother of Elrond, and they become the Númenóreans. But not all the men go. And those that remain behind, without contact with the elves or the Valar, susceptible to the influence, the rule of men corrupted by Morgoth, or later by Sauron, those men who remain behind descend into a kind of Dark Age, losing their greatness of character. These men spread throughout Eriador, that space on the map between the Blue Mountains in the west and the Misty Mountains in the east. They learn agriculture from the Entwives, and they lead simple, medieval lives. They're called by the Gondorians the Men of Twilight, or the Middlemen, men who are shorter, less long-lived, and less powerful than those of Númenor and their descendants. And we're echoing here, of course, Tolkien's medievalist view of the classical world, the vanished greatness of Rome and Greece. The men of Eriador are those that remain. So we fast forward 500 years of medieval life in Eriador, and then the Númenóreans begin sailing back to Middle-earth, making contact with the Men of Twilight. Those Númenóreans who still love elves like to visit with and even settle in Eriador, close to where the elves are in Lindon by the Blue Mountains. The Númenóreans who are more elf-skeptical like to go further south to the area that will become Gondor. When the final apocalypse comes to Númenor and it is shattered and sunk, the survivors under the leadership of Elendil flee to the shores of Middle-earth, where they find those Númenóreans and Men of the Twilight who have been living there this whole time. Elendil takes Eregion for himself, forging the nation of Arnor. His sons, Isildur and Anarion, take the south, creating the nation of Gondor. Technically, Arnor is the more prestigious of the two kingdoms because it is the home of the High King, but Gondor is always more populous and prosperous. A century passes, and then we're off to the War of the Last Alliance, where Elendil and Anarion will fall, Isildur will cut the One Ring from the hand of Sauron and claim it as his own. This is the beginning of the Third Age. Isildur dies 2 years later at the Gladden Fields, but his youngest son, Valinor, is kept safe at Rivendell and takes the throne of Arnor. At this point, the two kingdoms are split, essentially distinct from one another. Arnor in the north, Gondor in the south. 800 years pass as Arnor is in a kind of slow decline. When the 10th king of the Northern Kingdom dies in 861 of the Third Age, the kingdom splinters into 3 new kingdoms, Arthedain, Cardolan, and Ruthaur, each inherited by one of the squabbling Arnorian princes. Arthedain is the west of Eregion and includes the region that will later be called the Shire. Cardolan is everything east of the Brandywine south of the East Road. Ruthaur is everything north of the East Road between the Weather Hills and the Misty Mountains. There are tensions between the 3 nations, not least of all because they all want to claim Amon Sul, Weathertop, because of the fortification and the palantir that are there. Centuries pass, and the splintered kingdom is susceptible to attacks from the kingdom of Angmar, led by the Witch King from the north. Cardolan and Ruthaur fall, which is a cool story that we don't really have time for in this episode. Meanwhile, All the way in the east, the hobbits originate in the Vales of Anduin on the eastern side of the Misty Mountains, descended, it is thought, from man. But under the threat of men from further east, they begin to move west, crossing the Misty Mountains and making their way through the ravaged, empty, hollow lands of Ruthaur and Cardlan, coming to small villages like Bree. In 1601 of the Third Age, Marco and Blanco Fallowhide cross the Brandywine for the first time, and find on the western bank the rich, fertile lands reserved by the King of Arthedain as a hunting ground. With the permission of the king, they settle in the Shire, and almost all of the remaining hobbits wandering east of the Brandywine and even east of the mountains find their way there. In less than 30 years, we're told, almost all of the hobbits in Middle-earth live in the Shire, save perhaps some Stoors who live near the Anduin and who might, someday, find jewelry at the bottom of the river. The Shire is protected by the power of Arthedain and its king for 250 years, during which time hobbit culture flourishes. In 1974 of the Third Age, though, Arthedain falls to the Witch King of Angmar and his forces, but the retaliatory attack from a Gondorian army and the elves of Lindon and Rivendell destroys Angmar in turn. The land, all of Eregion, is now largely empty, and the hobbits are overlooked. The only change to Shire life is the quiet appointment of a Thane to lead the Shire domestically. And peacefully, quietly, in a corner of the world far from anyone's attention, the Shire persists for 1,000 years, protected by the Dunedain, the remnant of the Númenóreans of the Northern Kingdom, and one itinerant wizard, until, that is, the return of the King of Arnor and Gondor following the War of the Ring, Aragorn, Elisar. He acknowledges that the Shire is within the bounds of the reunited kingdom, but also grants it special recognition as a protected enclave, preventing any but hobbits from entering into or living in the bounds of the Shire. 25 years later, he'll expand the area of the enclave to include the Tower Hills to the west. The size of the Shire, even prior to that expansion, is surprisingly difficult to pin down, largely because Tolkien inconsistently revises measurements of distance as he moves through The Lord of the Rings. In the prologue to the first edition of The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien states, quote, 50 leagues it stretched, from the West March under the Tower Hill to the Brandywine Bridge, and nearly 50 from the northern moors to the marshes in the south. End quote. A league, for clarity here, is a 3-mile distance. Therefore, the Shire is 150 miles wide, according to that initial description. In the second edition, though, we're told that it's 40 leagues from the far downs to the Brandywine Bridge, and he strikes the nearly from the north-south distance. 50 leagues, then. And that's the measurement that stands. That's how scholars like Robert Foster and Karen Wynne Fonstad come up with this 18 to 21,000 square mile area for the Shire. But that isn't the only change that Tolkien makes to the geography of the Shire. He revises, crucially, the length of the High Hay, the hedge which functions as a border between Buckland and the Old Forest. He changes its original length of 40 miles down to only 20 miles, without changing a detail on the map. This forces Hammond and Skull, in the preparation of the 50th anniversary edition of The Lord of the Rings, to change the distance from Bucklebury Ferry to the Brandywine Bridge from 20 miles, as it was in the book up to that point and still is in the movies, to only 10 miles, recognizing the textual change made by Tolkien and its precedence. So a measurable distance on the maps of the Shire is halved by the author, but the general shape of the Shire, the relationships between these spaces, don't seem to change. And it's not just one changed number that poses a problem. When we get back to the Shire at the end of the story, we're told that it's 40 miles from the Brandywine Bridge to Hobbiton, which on the map is consistent with that 20-mile length of the High Hay, not the 40-mile original length. Everything works and is consistent, including the placement of the 3 farthing stone, which we're told is near the center of the Shire, if we revise down that original statement in the prologue and reduce the width of the Shire from 120 miles to somewhere between 75 and 90, which would cut the area of the Shire from around 18,000 square miles to somewhere between 9,000 and 13,000, depending on whether or not you reduce the north-south size of the Shire to either maintain the same proportion or leave it at the original 50 leagues. I, personally, would err on the lower side of that estimate. That makes the Shire about the same size as Vermont, or 10 to 15% larger than Wales, or, crucially, 10 to 15% smaller than the English Midlands, a place which Tolkien credits as direct inspiration for the Shire. It's not an inconsiderable place by any means, but it's also not as sprawling as the conventionally accepted estimates. By the way, Tolkien wasn't insensible to these questions of distance and the contradictions in the text. For more, see The Return of the Shadow, the 6th volume of the history of Middle-earth. A quick and dirty comparison of the population of medieval England to this smaller 9,000 square mile theoretical area for the Shire gives us a hobbit population somewhere around 250,000 hobbits in total, which sounds like a lot, but is a population density of only around 25 hobbits per square mile. I'll admit, that feels high, but we can see from the text that the hobbits are a social, gregarious bunch, which suggests that their populations are concentrated in the villages of the Shire, in Hobbiton and Bywater and Frogmorton and Stock and Woody End and Mickledelving, leaving the countryside between minimally populated by farmers, largely untilled countryside. It's also possible that the North Farthing and the West Farthing are much less populous than the East or the South. The density of hobbits in the villages, given studies of medieval English villages, the closest point of real-world comparison, suggest 500 or 600 hobbits living and farming within 3 square miles. We're told that in Bree, there are 100 stone houses of the big people, plus an unknown but additional number of hobbit holes, which might suggest a population consistent with that number. In the end, though, there's just not enough material in the text to be sure, and your judgment on how populous the Shire is, how much of it is developed into farmland, and what Mickledelving looks like will depend largely on what feels intuitively right to you. But if you're in the 100,000 to 150,000 hobbits range, I think that you are broadly right. Another interesting detail about Shire life is the calendar system that gives this podcast its name, Shire Reckoning. It's derived in part from the old Germanic calendar, and though it seems like a complicated arrangement, it has several qualities which I think recommend it over our own real-life Gregorian calendar. The first thing to note here, I suppose, is that despite the fact that Tolkien gives us recognizable names for days and months through The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, these are translations. The Shire calendar is subtly different from our own, which makes direct comparisons, well, let's say a little tricky. The Shire calendar begins in the year 1601 of the Third Age, which is year 1, Shire Reckoning. Thus, the years of Steward's Reckoning, the calendar used in Gondor from the middle of the Third Age onward, are 1600 years ahead of the Shire. The War of the Ring happens in 3018 and 3019, according to Gondor, and 1418, 1419 of Shire Reckoning. The week in the Shire has 7 days, and begins on Sturday, like our Saturday, which is dedicated to the stars Varda made in the heavens. Sunday and Monday are, just like ours, dedicated to the sun and moon, respectively. Tuesday is dedicated to the trees of Valinor. Heaven's Day to the, heavens. Mersday to the sea. And High Day, the last day of the week, and usually a half-day holiday. High Day is dedicated to the Valar. Now, the enterprising scholar at this point might be tempted to ask, how much do the hobbits know about Varda and the trees of Valinor and the Valar in general? And the answer seems to be not much, if anything, but these names for days may well be translated by the hobbits from the calendar system of Arnor, the Northern Kingdom, when the hobbits first came into the Shire. The existence of a 7-day week implies that the basis of the calendar was originally the lunar cycle. 28-day lunar cycles break neatly into 4 7-day units. But there have been changes made to the Shire calendar, just as there have been changes made to our many real-world calendars, to accommodate the fact that the lunar cycle does not neatly fit into the solar cycle, which is much more important for tracking seasons. So presumably we started from 7-day weeks tracking the movement of the moon, the most obvious celestial clock. The hobbits then revised this calendar into 12 30-day months, with a few extra days thrown in to account for our rotation around the sun. And of course, Arda has been orbiting the sun for almost 1700 years before the hobbits come to the Shire. The year begins in the deep midwinter, between 2 days which aren't a part of any month. These are the 2 days of Yule, the middle of the celebration of Yuletide, and they mark the end of the old year, first Yule, and the beginning of the new year, second Yule. The next day we begin the first month of the year. The names for the months, by the way, are taken from the Old English names of the months in the real world, which means that they fit less organically within the legendarium. So we have 30 days of after Yule, the first month of the year, which is pretty self-evident. And then the 30 days of Solmath, meaning mud month. Then Rith, rough month. Astron, which really stands out here because it's a modernization of the Old English word for Easter. Thrimage, meaning 3 milk givings, the Old English name for May, and then Forlyth, meaning before Lythe, which is a midsummer break from the regular calendar, just like Yule. There are usually 3 days of Lythe: first Lythe, mid-year's day, and second Lythe. In leap years, every 4 years, the hobbits add another day between mid-year's day and second Lythe called Overlythe. So every 4 years, we take a break in the summer and we celebrate first Lythe, mid-year's day, Overlythe, and second Lythe. And after that, we're back into regular months for the back half of the year. Afterlife comes first for obvious reasons, then Wedmuth, meaning grass month, Halamuth, meaning, again, weirdly for the Shire, holy month. The 10th month is Winterfilth, meaning winter filling, then Blotmath, sacrifice month, and then we arrive at Forjul, 30 days to take us back to the Yule break and the end of the year. One strange quirk here is that mid-year's day, and Overlythe too, if it is a leap year, are not days of the week. If first Lythe is a Monday, then second Lythe will be a Tuesday, regardless of whether there is a day between them or 2 days between them. A consequence of this is that hobbits don't have calendar drift. In our real world, if November 1st is a Thursday this year, then it'll be a Friday next year and a Saturday the following year, unless it's a leap year, in which case it'll jump ahead 2 days from Saturday to Monday, and so on. The Shire calendar doesn't do that because 364 days, 12 months of 30 plus 2 days of Lythe and 2 days of Yule, breaks perfectly into 52 weeks. Therefore, the first day of after Yule is always a Saturday, and so on through the year, which means that if it's your birthday on High Day, it's always going to be your birthday on High Day. That means, by the way, that Bilbo and Frodo celebrate their birthdays, September 22nd, as we're told, but to the hobbits, the 22nd day of Halamuth, actually more like September 12th in our calendar, but the 22nd day of Halamuth always takes place on a Mer's Day, or the Sea's Day, which is a particularly poetic coincidence, given how their stories end. The consequence of all of this means that though we can readily understand the dates that Tolkien gives us, the book seduces us into drawing incorrect inferences in terms of the passage of time and the days on which certain events take place. The Entmoot, for example, begins on the 29th day of Solmath in the year 1419 by Shire reckoning, which is translated in the book as February 29th. That's the date given in the Tale of Years, actually, but it's usually thought that the Entmoot begins on February 30th. Neither day would exist in our calendar. All of this is to say that the Shire is an odd combination of very fine detail and broad sketch. It is a land of contrasts, as they say, largely because those elements which are specific to Tolkien's secondary creation, calendars and language, for example, are developed and realized and full, and those elements which are essentially the same as his bucolic, idyllic view of life in the English Midlands of Worcestershire and Warwickshire are largely imported without comment. Weather and landscape and social hierarchy, agriculture, dialect, economy, and more. And though Tolkien writes that the Shire is not a utopia, it is nonetheless a vision of beautiful, gentle, sun-dappled pastoral antiquity, uniquely, specifically English, steeped in a nostalgia for a pre-industrial world of less noise and more green, of stability in society, of small concerns and a much slower pace of life. Tolkien is building on ideas of the hypothetical deep England, the merry England, the England of the high medieval and early modern period, but crucially, unlike most depictions of this England, from the earliest peasant revolts against French rule through the chaos of the Reformation and the establishment of empire, through the world wars of the 20th century to modern, nationalist, white supremacist rhetoric, unlike almost all of those perspectives and movements that seek to evoke a very similar representation of England, Tolkien does not situate the Shire in opposition to anyone, or to present it as either righteously dominant or unjustly dominated. There is no Middle-earth version of France against whom the worth of the Shire folk can be measured. There are no distant lands of exotic riches which are just waiting to be exploited and educated. With the exception of the scouring of the Shire, there's no present evil which we can measure against our memories of a better yesterday. There's no present active king. There's no flag, there's no anthem, there's no sense of active defensive nationalism. Tolkien gives us a vision of England which is stripped of its worst qualities, or purged of them, might be a better way of putting it, because the pride of England has also been purged. The hobbits are content, not because their Shire is a utopia, The Shire is a utopia because the hobbits are content. This week, I received a really fascinating question, or more generally, I suppose, a topic from Andrew, who writes, quote, "The treatment of the rings circa the War of the Ring appear to me to be inconsistent. When Bilbo gives the one ring of Sauron to Frodo, he appears to age very quickly, undoing some of the influence of the ring. But Gollum lost the ring 77 years ago by the time that he appears in the Two Towers, and he doesn't seem any different. Similarly, Sauron makes the one ring to dominate the other rings of power, but then he loses it and it sits at the bottom of a river for hundreds of years. Why can Sauron still command the Nazgul, even though he doesn't have his ruling ring?" Excellent questions, Andrew. Thank you. And thank you, too, for your very kind words about the podcast that I won't quote on the show because, come on, I may have been in these United States for 15 years, but I'm still a Scotsman. It's becoming clear that I do need to do a whole show on the Rings of Power in the near future because they are such a fascinating and foundational topic. But for now, let's see what we can do by taking these questions in reverse order. Sauron commands the ring wraiths in the absence of the One Ring because he has taken possession of the 9, of the specific rings to which the Nazgul are bound. This is a little bit contradictory in the text because during the Council of Elrond, Gandalf says explicitly, "The 9 the Nazgul keep, the 7 are taken or destroyed." At this Glowin stirred but did not speak. "The 3 we know of. What then is this one that he desires so much?" But a whole book earlier, back in Shadows of the Past, Gandalf previously told Frodo that Sauron has in fact gathered the 9 to himself. Later, Galadriel will tell Frodo that he saw the eye of him that holds the 7 and the 9. So we don't know when it happened, but it seems absolutely clear that Sauron took back the 9 from the Nazgul, possibly after the One Ring was cut from his hand by Isildur, presumably in order to ensure their obedience going forward. What's really interesting here, though, is that the Nazgul now connect the two halves of this question together, because if that's true, if Sauron has been in possession of the 9 for, let's say, hundreds, if not thousands of years, then why haven't the Nazgul lessened in their supernatural power and returned to a more mortal experience? And it's tempting, I think, to imagine that this longevity is simply a function of exposure, right? Gollum had the ring for 10 times as long as Bilbo had it, so maybe it'll take 10 times longer for the effect to wear off. The Nazgul carried their rings for 1,500 years at least, and possibly much longer, so maybe there is just a point at which ring exposure becomes permanent. But I'm not convinced by that line of argument, partly because it stands in opposition to how things generally work in Tolkien's Legendarium. That is to say, things get worse over time, not better. What is the restorative mechanism by which the evil of the ring over the ring-bearer is undone over time? Why would we assume that anyone in Tolkien's world would just spontaneously recover? Bilbo, of course, isn't spontaneously recovering. He is in Rivendell, after all, so perhaps it's the influence of Elrond, who we know to be a great healer, even absent the possession of his own ring. Without the healing magic of the elves, we might speculate Gollum and the Nazgul just remain as they are? It's possible. But for me, there's a more convincing explanation, and it's simply this. If we assume that Sauron took the rings from the Nazgul, possibly individually, probably by force, possibly even before the War of the Last Alliance, when he was at his greatest power and commanded the ring, then Bilbo is distinguished as being the only ring-bearer to give up the ring voluntarily. Until Samwise Gamgee, at least. And I think that rejection of the ring, the choice to give it up, is far more likely, from my understanding of Tolkien's world, to allow Bilbo this slow restoration to his true self. Whereas the fierce, unreasoning, uncompromising desire for a ring, the 1 for Gollum, the 9 for the Nazgul, seems to me likely to keep them in their fallen forms, making them, if anything, darker, more savage, more desperate. And we might even take this reading and extend it to the Smeagol-Gollum duality that we see later. That, perhaps, is a conversation for another day. Thank you, Andrew, for your question. That one was really fun. I realized this morning that I asked in last week's episode for your opinions on the best performance in the Hobbit trilogy of movies and then completely neglected to post about it on social media or to mention it in the Tuesday show, which means that I have had a grand total of zero responses, which honestly Doesn't feel disproportionate given most fans' feelings about these movies. But since I performed the formality of asking the question, I will now, into this hollow chamber, perform the formality of answering it. For me, I think almost half, well, maybe not quite half, but almost half of the performances of the dwarves are good, trending to great. I think that James Nesbitt is lovely as Boffer, exercising all his twinkly charm and soulfulness that made him successful as an actor in the first place. I think he's positioned really beautifully. Graham McTavish is really solid as Dwalin, though we do kind of hamstring his performance by keeping him in a single gear for too much of the story. We don't make enough of his ability as an actor to turn his performance on a dime, either for the somber or the furious, or very rarely and especially the charming. I think that Dean O'Gorman is pretty good, honestly, as Keeley, and while Aidan Turner is not particularly good as Feely, the problems with that character stem primarily from the writing, and I'm not sure that you could have found an actor to really make, honestly, either Feely or Keeley completely work. I do think that Richard Armitage gives a really solid performance as Thorin, though it is lacking in some texture, and he's never at his best when he is alone on a soundstage surrounded by tennis balls and green screens indicating future CGI effects. Which leaves my absolute favorite performance. Of course, it is Ken Stott as Balin, who manages to bring this lovely, gentle gravitas and dignity to the entire proceedings. He embodies the sense of history that I always feel the dwarves should carry with them. It is a remarkably composed and confident performance, and I genuinely love it. If you agree or disagree, get in touch and let me know, and also get in touch to answer this brand new question of the week, picking up off of a conversation I had with Nick during the week, off of a comment that I made in last week's show about whether or not Rivendell really is the best vacation spot in Middle-earth. So, if you had to spend a week anywhere in Middle-earth, hanging out with the locals, sampling the culture and the food, taking in the landscape, plus any obvious local activities like sailing on the Long Lake by Dale or climbing trees, I guess, in the Woodland Realm, or horse riding with the Rohirrim, if you could go anywhere, where would you go and why? Does the answer change if it's a family vacation or a romantic getaway or a conference? Would you go to CritCon, the biggest pop culture convention in all of Crick Hollow? Get in touch and let me know your thoughts. Shire Reckoning Pod, wherever social network things are happening, or email me directly, shirereckoningpod@gmail.com. And if you have a moment, please take a moment to leave a rating, leave a review on your podcast app of choice, or much better yet, tell somebody you know about this weird, nerdy show that you like. And because we spent so long on the calendar at the beginning of this episode, I should clarify that I intend to continue with Tolkien's translated dates for the purposes of this almanac, for this day in fictional history segment, because A, it's much more straightforward, and B, it isn't actually in any way significant, except for the importance that we attribute to it. So why not make it easy? Why not make it as transparent as we can? So, the big anniversary this week is that the 14th of August is the 71st anniversary of the publication of The Gods Return to Earth, C.S. Lewis's review of The Fellowship of the Ring for the British literary magazine Time and Tide. It is fantastically overblown, and it reads more than a little bit as the proud endorsement of someone who has seen this text take its shape paragraph by paragraph over years. I will quote here the beginning of the third paragraph. Quote, "Such a book has, of course, its predestined readers, even now more numerous and more critical than is always realized. To them a reviewer need say little, except that here are beauties which pierce like swords or burn like cold iron. Here is a book that will break your heart. They will know that this is good news, good beyond hope. To complete their happiness, one need only add that it promises to be gloriously long. This volume is only the first of 3. End quote. A fantastic piece of writing. The link is in the show notes. In Arda, today, August 10th, is the day of the funeral of King Theoden in Edoras. Out of doubt, out of dark, to the day's rising, he rode singing in the sun's sword unsheathing. Hope he rekindled, and in hope ended. Over death, over dread, over doom lifted, out of loss, out of life, unto long glory. That same day, Faramir and Éowyn are betrothed after falling in love previously in the Gardens of Healing. On the 14th of August, the party will leave Edoras. Arwen here will say goodbye to her father for the final time in a scene that we are presented at a great distance in one of the more touching and evocative moments in this sequence of farewells that we're going to make over the next 100 pages of the book. None saw her last meeting with Elrond her father, for they went up into the hills and there spoke long together, and bitter was their parting that should endure beyond the ends of the world. Merry receives his horn here from Éomer and Éowyn, which will be so significant when he returns to the Shire, and Éomer tells him, quote, "Kings of old would have laden you with gifts that Owain could not bear for your deeds upon the fields of Mundburg, and yet you will take naught, you say, but the arms that were given to you. This I suffer, for indeed I have no gift that is worthy. But my sister begs you to receive this small thing, as a memorial of Durnhelm and of the horns of the mark at the coming of the morning." End quote. The following day, the 15th, Treebeard will release Saruman from his imprisonment in Orthanc because, as Treebeard later says, he hates the caging of living things and "I will not keep even such creatures as these caged beyond great need." We'll talk about that and Gandalf's alternative explanation on the 22nd. To briefly round up our collection of scholarship for the week, I will begin with the best thing that I read, the brilliant Dimitra Fimi's Substack post, Tolkien Tuesday, Tolkien, Landscape Archaeology, and the First Age of Middle-earth. This piece is apparently largely drawn from writing not used for her PhD dissertation, which is dispiriting, honestly, considering how accessible and precise and engaging it is. If you're interested in our discussion of burial places and monuments in the Silmarillion over on Stars and Swords, my genre fiction podcast, then I would particularly recommend it. That's Dimitra Fimi's Substack. The link is in the show notes. Stephen C. Winter, who I think I've mentioned here before and is always worth a read, has a piece at Wisdom from the Lord of the Rings on the File of Galadriel and the encounter with Shelob. It is a really great read. And those, I must confess, are the only things that I have read this week that I wanted to share. It has been a busy time with the end of summer vacation, the return to the academic calendar here in our small college town, and the changing of the seasons, formally, if not according to the weather. As ever, if you read anything that you would like to recommend, please let me know and I will pass them along. Oh, there was one more thing. I was looking at the gorgeous 70th anniversary illustrated Lord of the Rings on the HarperCollins website. HarperCollins, the owner of the William Morrow imprint, so this is the publisher's website. And the first line of the product description is an inline text ad for Rings of Power available now on Prime Video. So, tell me you copied and pasted the promotional blurb for your $300 collected edition without telling me you copied and pasted the promotional blurb for your $300 collected edition. If anyone at HarperCollins or William Morrow feels contrition about this, I will accept a formal apology in the form of a $300 collected edition of The Lord of the Rings. And that is going to do it for this week's episode of Shire Reckoning. Join me on Tuesday, 9 p.m. Central Time for Chapter 4 of The Hobbit and some thoughts on stone giants and goblin songs. Follow Shire Reckoning Pod on Instagram and Blue Sky. Email me your questions and comments, shirereckoningpod@gmail.com, and help support independent, ad-free podcasting and get access to our weekly bonus show, Last Call at the Green Dragon, by visiting patreon.com/nextword. Thanks so much for listening. I'll talk to you all again next week. Bye.